right button?
contained cannabis.
That's
We're going to get started right on time. My name is Mimi Long. I teach Japanese literature in the Department of East Asian Studies, and our department is delighted to welcome Dr. Chelsea Schieder, who completed her PhD in history at Columbia in 2014 with a dissertation titled Co-eds Ruined the Nation, the Female Student as Political Subject in the Japanese New Left, 1957 to 1972. During her PhD research, she spent a year at Waseda University, and since earning her doctorate, she's held 2 assistant professor posts in Tokyo, first at Meiji University, and currently at Aoyama Gakuin University. Her first book on women students and the Japanese New Left is currently under contract with Duke University Press. Do we have a date for publication?
Well, the final revisions are due April. Is that too honest?
No, we're impressed. It's a wonderful book. She has published numerous articles on gender protest, labor activism, and violence in both the 1960s and 70s, and in Abe Shinzo's far-right contemporary Japan. Chelsea's second book project focuses on coal, specifically on the Mitsui Miike mine in Kyushu, and the legal battles fought around health and environmental damages by miners' wives, organized labor, activist lawyers, scientists, students, and other ordinary people in robust networks that made environmental issues a mainstream concern in post-war Japan. I'll let her introduce her own talk, but we're very glad to have you.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Mimi, and thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be here today. I'm so happy to meet many of you whom I've only known by name or reputation, and I'm really happy to be able to share my work. I'm interested in comments and questions, and I will go ahead and proceed. So first I'd like to say, I understand this is an environmental humanities hire, and I think you'll notice I don't necessarily invoke the environment by name. But I will end with a consideration of how I think my work engages with the environmental humanities. But instead of explicitly naming the environment, I focus on contentious politics and the idea of progress. And now progress I see as linked to modernity, and it does involve a certain view of resources and resource use. And I think we can understand a lot about what is considered commonsensical or natural in terms of resource use by examining how societies have negotiated ideas about progress. And my interest in contentious politics stems from an interest in how a society negotiates issues and goals and definitions of progress. And so researching social movements like the New Left in Japan that held high economic growth accountable to its promises of progress helped me understand the possibilities and pitfalls of the strategies and formulations of protest in Japan. And these are lessons that I think, or ideas that I think can carry and be applied elsewhere. But I do find Japan to be a particularly rich site to explore questioning an idea of progress because of the durability and strength of narratives of progress. And another powerful myth at work in Japanese society and history is that modernization, industrialization, and economic achievement came about because of exceptional social cohesion and consensus. And I've called this before sometimes the straw man that just won't blow away, because there's a lot of really good work about contentious politics and protest and dissent. But I do think that by examining contentious politics, I can tease out the dynamics at play, not just in protest or in dissent or contentious politics, but also how has this protest, which has been a very dynamic part of modern Japanese society, sometimes been written out of that history. So, and then I hope to demonstrate here how such concerns about narratives of progress and contentious challenges to that progress operate my work and lead me to understand my work in relation with environmental humanities. So the title of this talk is My Love, My Rebellion, the Gendered Politics of Care, Authority, and Protest in Post-War Japan. So the keywords here, gendered politics. How do ideas about who should operate how politically based on their gender, how does that influence ideas about care? How does that influence ideas about authority? How does that influence ideas about protest? And how are those things linked? The title, My Love, My Rebellion, I take from this collection, which is the title under which the writings of female student activist and biology graduate student Tokoro Mitsuko were published in 1969, shortly after her death from a very rare connective tissue disease. So as the title suggests, part of Tokoro's political philosophy was the idea that protest or rebellion related to love. And I'm going to use Tokoro, lean on Tokoro, or use her words and her ideas to explore how I think about women in the Japanese New Left, and then how what I've done, the research I've done on women in the Japanese New Left, informs my concerns in my next project, which is much more fully engaged with environmental humanities. So Tokoro based her analyses that are collected in this book on her own experience as an activist. She was involved with student movements from the late 1950s, the mass demonstrations in 1960 against the renewal of the US-Japan Security Treaty, and she often articulated her thoughts in relationship to the New Left, inasmuch as the New Left also was a leftist alternative to what was often seen at the time as a dogmatic, hierarchical, and non-revolutionary establishment left of the Japan Communist Party and the Japan Socialist Party. And so I began to be interested in Tokoro's work when I began to research the New Left in Japan, because she was influential to the campus-based leftist movement that rocked universities across the nation in the late 1960s, but her participation and also her political philosophy sat uneasily alongside two dominant perceptions of the New Left in Japan, and two dominant legacies. So the first is that the Japanese New Left, particularly in the late 1960s, is generally characterized in mainstream sources today as too extreme, particularly in its violence, and it's sometimes thought of as somehow essentially inclined towards cultishness and explosive violence and spectacular confrontational strategies. The other dominant perception of the New Left in Japan, dominant legacy, is that it is generally narrated as a male movement and event. So I think these two legacies make it impossible to adequately examine the role the massive student demonstrations from the early 1960s, but particularly in the late 1960s, played in Japanese politics and society. My interest in the New Left came from the fact that it was a really important critique of a dominant modernizing narrative in a period of high economic growth. But it also tried to counter that modernizing narrative and that narrative progress by formulating a sense of a deeply interlinked global society with an ethos of being together that was not quite the same as a sort of fascistic or right-wing sense of community. So how could you have a sort of leftist solidarity that was not kind of a fascistic, ethnic, or nationalistic collective community, or what in Japanese is kyodotai? So to me, this seemed like a really important critique of progress that wasn't a retreat into a right-wing vision of a national community or an ethnic community or a nationalistic collective. But it was also a movement that really did fail spectacularly, in some cases through sectarian violence, and in other cases through exclusions of ethnic others, zainichi, or foreign exchange students from Vietnam or China, but then also of women. And I think that these two commonly held ideas about the New Left, that it was inherently extremely violent and that it was male, are linked and have a lot to do with the post-war formulation of gendered politics. And so with the manuscript I'm now completing, I sought to understand the legacy of New Left violence through the legacy of this perceived male New Left by confronting the very strange erasure of female activist participation. And it wasn't just women like Tokoro Mitsuko who were prominent in the movement who rendered this male evaluation of the New Left odd. I also thought it was really strange that the New Left in Japan is described as male because one of the key structural changes that shaped the context in which the Japanese New Left emerged was the radical post-war educational reform that integrated female students into formerly all-male institutions of higher education. So it wasn't just particular figures like Tokuro Mitsuko, or I also write about Kamba Michiko, who died in the 1960 mass demonstrations as a kind of prominent maiden sacrifice, or the femme fatales of Nagata Hiroko or Shigenobu Fusako, who engaged in more extremist sects later. These women are very interesting, and I've written about them as well, but it wasn't just these prominent women, it was also the fact that the institutions where the New Left were occurring had been made coeducational, so the student movement was occurring as a co-ed movement in a degree that had never been seen before in Japan. And so in trying to understand how female students both participated in and even became symbolic of the New Left in Japan, I came to see female participation as revealing a central tension in radical activism in Japan, and in its reception by mainstream society. So this tortured negotiation about the participation of women in social movements is not unique to the New Left, and it's not unique to the New Left in Japan. Many scholars have noted rise of a sort of masculinist New Left culture in many different contexts. But I do think the way that the New Left in Japan is often narrated as a particularly male event is a little unusual. And a key legacy of the New Left globally has been the emergence of a subsequent women's liberation movement. And so this is already a really interesting story. Why does the New Left seem to be a prehistory for women's liberation movements, not just in Japan, but globally? But I also wanted to know why female participation had been so thoroughly written out of the history of the New Left in Japan as a movement and an event. So I saw one of my tasks as writing women back into the New Left, both conspicuous women like Tokuro Mitsuko, who wrote or were prominent leaders, ranging from vulnerable sacrifices to kind of New Left femme fatales, or even radical education mamas. There are these kind of symbolic types. But also in writing in the invisible organizational support work, or what we might call care work, I came to understand the work of female students in the Japanese New Left, often at newly co-ed institutions, as truly, and to many frighteningly revolutionary, in ways that were constantly policed and undermined from outside the movement and also within the movement. But I also see it as something that gave the New Left a lot of its real power at the time. So that's where I got my title for my manuscript, which I call Co-ed Revolution, which emphasizes both that this sort of attempt at revolution, this social movement occurred at co-educational institutions, and I also adopt the term co-ed to indicate the female student. I translate Joshigakuse as co-ed because I think it has those reactionary valences of women as a supplement to the gakuse, which is presumed to be male, so kind of a co-ed. So, and to point out that the co-ed herself represented a potentially revolutionary figure. With that, let's turn to Tokuro Mitsuko to begin to illustrate what I mean about the female student activist representing a potentially revolutionary figure. And then I also will use the work of Tokuro to give you a sense, the work of Tokuro, and then a sense of what I also found about female student participation in the New Left, to give you a sense of how I also came to understand that scholarship might need to reconceive the relationships between care, authority, and protest to produce analyses also that are less focused on leaders and spectacular demonstrations and events, and more attentive to the everyday participation and organization that ultimately contributes to a movement's longevity and long-term influence. And this is where I also see strain in my own work of an interest in sustainability, although it's in considering how social movements can be sustained or not. I think that can contribute to understandings about sustainability more generally. So I'm going to talk about one of Tokoro Mitsuko's best known pieces. She did die young. She was a PhD student in biology and science. But in her collected writing, she has several formal essays that were published in journals like the Progressive Intellectual Journal, Science of Thought, Shiso no Kagaku, but also many, many speeches. She traveled widely throughout Japan and spoke quite a bit. But she became best known for a piece that she called what I translate as Toward the Anticipated Organization. It's not a perfect translation. It's yokan sareru soshiki ni yosete. So yokan kind of means more that you would, a premonition of a movement to come. And in it, Tokoro outlined her thoughts about how a truly anti-capitalist and compassionate left ought to question ideas of progress, authority, and efficiency as they are structured by capitalism. And her main point was, how can you have a movement that is anti-capitalist that operates according to the logic of capitalism? And there she was particularly concerned with the way that the Japan Communist Party had a very dogmatic, strict, and hierarchical form with orders coming from the top, and which she saw as reflecting the capitalist logic of production, that you have people who play certain roles, this kind of rationalization in the authority. And so she argued for a movement that focused on debates and what she called endless debate rather than orders. And so in this way, actually, what Tokoro is calling for is what scholars have subsequently dubbed prefigurative politics. And they've identified this as a kind of practice that is central to many new left movements. So prefigurative politics indicates a political philosophy that emphasizes the development of alternative political processes and forms that could prefigure the ideal society. This is not new with the new left. There's a lot that comes out of anarchist thought and whatnot, this kind of building, the new world in the shell of the old. But this, we can see in Tokoro yet another new inflection of this idea that you cannot have a movement that is replicating the logic you were trying to undermine. However, in the latter section of the same essay, which one critic cited as too extreme and fanciful, Tokoro imagined that her vision of a compassionate left could be fostered by applying a kind of mother's logic, what she calls bolsei no ronri. And in other essays she follows up and refines this and calls this women's logic, josei no ronri. And she defines this as care for the most vulnerable members of society. And so from the left, Tokoro articulated her challenges to the hierarchical and dogmatic organization of the established left in Japan through the frame of what she identified as feminine nurturing, seeing kindness and nurturing as the most radical critique of the violence of scientific and economic rationalism. Now, I'm going to talk in a moment about how this is in many ways very problematic. And the problems begin with some of her sources of inspiration. Tokoro was very interested and inspired by Takamura Itsue's ideas about maybe some kind of original gynocentric society in Japan that was obscured by the rise of perhaps the import of a more masculine order, maybe first from China and then later from the West. And Takamura herself, when her writings were published at the time Tokoro was reading them, the essays that were left out of her work were her essays about how this maternalist vision would service the Japanese Empire. So there is a kind of historical amnesia that I will talk about a little bit more already. But also, Tokoro was very interested in Simone Weil, And Simone Weil's ideas that science, in declaring its objectivity, has created its own new mystifications. And I find this very interesting because Tokoro herself was a scientist, was a biologist. Her PhD thesis is also part of these collected writings. I tried to read it, I can't. But Tokoro was also, in many ways in her work, again, trying to rework this line. What is the community and the commune, right? This kind of understanding of commons, a nurturing of the commons, including the commons of children. And then what is the Kyodo tie, this kind of ethnic, insular, excluding community? How do you walk that line? I'm sorry. Oh, no, sorry.
Go the other way.
So I'm going to turn now to talk about the context Tokoro was writing in, because I think it's really important. Because Tokoro's understanding of women's logic, she linked women's social relationship with care to a politics that challenged authority. And that strikes me as really interesting. And also what interests me about her essay is how thoroughly the first half of the essay became incorporated into the politics of the campus-based New Left, and how completely the concerns voiced in the second part of the essay were dropped out of the New Left. Although they're problematic and in many ways essentialist, her ideas about women's logic pointed to a politics of care or nurturing. And while the embrace of endless debate and a non-hierarchical New Left were in many ways embraced, ideas of a nurturing New Left were completely erased. So that's why that essay really interested me. And in many senses, so I just read Gail Hirschhatter's new book, Women in China's Revolutions, and Hirschhatter is also asking, well, what does big history, what does the big story look like when we look at it from the experience of rural women, right? And, and it doesn't have to be women necessarily, but in Tokoro's works, I see a kind of struggle to do something similar, to understand, to undermine the big events, the spectacular history, the big history, with attention to how people live their lives and experience their lived lives. The problem is Tokoro is not a historian, and her perception of women's experiences are often based on her kind of imagination of how those things are. But this association, and this is when, although Tokoro's not a historian, we can historicize Tokoro. So her association between women and peace certainly reflects the context in which she was writing, in which she was participating in political activism, in a time in which there was a strong assumption that women were inherently pacifist and nurturing. And I've called this a kind of ascent of naive politics, and the idea that women were essentially pacifist and nurturing was really critical to the integration of women into post-war politics in Japan. So the way that the war becomes configured in post-war Japan is that the war was a male project, and that letting women into formerly all-male institutions of politics and education would tame whatever sort of violent male impulses were in these institutions. And this defines women by being inherently apolitical, non-ideological, or kind of naive political actors. And this is not new to the post-war period. Women groups in the pre-war period had campaigned against prostitution or partisan politics on such an understanding. And even in some cases, conservative male bureaucrats in the pre-war period had suggested giving women the vote to avoid, so that radical male politicians wouldn't get voted in, with the assumption that women are non-ideological actors. And so while post-war women's activism elided women's wartime mobilization in support of Japan's imperial and militaristic project by framing women as inherently victims of male authority and as the future supporters of a more peaceful order, it also implicitly amended that women needed to maintain this non-ideological political role as a condition of their political inclusion. And this did a couple things. It was an incredibly powerful post-war strategy that we can see to this day, that, that women could take a political role as apolitical actors, but acting politically as defenders of sort of these naive daily life issues faced by ordinary, sorry, a lot of these scare quotes, ordinary citizens against the machinations of a corrupt and authoritarian, presumably male, political elite. But then it also established really strong expectations about how women ought to be political, and the reason I'm talking about this whole context is because this is how I see women's participation in the New Left, which was a very self-consciously radical movement. This context shaped public reactions to female participation in New Left politics. And this could be incredibly sympathetic when they understood New Left women as particularly vulnerable, but this could also be incredibly hostile if New Left women were seen as threatening, undermining gender norms, or just too political. So I always take longer to talk than I actually think I will. So within the New Left, many young women did try to overcome this position accorded to apolitical women, but they often could not overcome the mainstream societal expectations that linked women with care work within the New Left as well. And so again, the New Left interests me because within these spaces, with both young men and young women participating in activism together, with an awareness that they wanted to break down hierarchy, also a heightened awareness of the stakes of everyday life in the double sense. Everyday life of business as usual. Everyday life as the obfuscation of all those violent geopolitical relationships. Everyday life as the way that the New Left linked my homeism, this idea that you needed to own your home, with the war in Vietnam, right? So that everyday life, which the New Left sought to disrupt, and then the everyday life, the daily lived experience in which we negotiate and renegotiate our intimate relationships in a way that can potentially counter received hierarchies, received wisdom. That kind of everyday life, that kind of experiment, that prefigurative politics, that space was also created in many of the barricaded campuses with young men and young women together trying to negotiate this new kind of space. The problem with this is that the gendered expectations that came to define the work in the barricades. And this exposed a major gap between the theories and practices of the co-ed student movement. So female student participants were located in a position to really feel the gap between this idea of getting rid of hierarchy and yet these often unspoken expectations that they would do the cooking, and onigiri, making rice balls, comes up in many accounts of former student activists as almost kind of a symbol of these persistent gender roles at work in the campus barricades. They recall just making endless piles of rice balls for meetings, whereas it was usually the men who spoke or wrote, and in a movement that increasingly valorized confrontations with authorities as authentic, as the authentic politics, and a movement that also did create a culture that was quite masculinist and sexist and misogynist also in many of its manifestations. The support work, the mimeographing, using a mimeograph machine, and the making onigiri, the cleaning up, the jail support When I interviewed one activist, he said he doesn't even know how the women did the jail support. You would go to jail, and the next thing you knew, there was a female activist there, and somehow she knew you were there, and then she found out what you needed and stuff. A lot of this care work exposed that the labor that reproduced the daily needs of the movement, the food, the printing, the pamphlets, was made invisible, thus rendering the mostly female labor that did this work invisible as well. So I'm going a little over, so almost. So this is where I'd like to notice that teasing out this history has presented me with a challenge to my own methodology as a scholar. So how can I reconceive the relationships between care, authority, and protest to produce analyses less focused on the leaders and spectacular demonstrations and more attentive to everyday participation and organization? And this is a case where there were prominent female student activists who did write, who did participate in a more sort of commonly recognized leadership way, but even when I read their own personal analyses of these, sometimes they were seen as kind of honorary males. They weren't expected because they could write and they could do theory. And so how do we consider participation that wasn't voiced? It didn't participate in terms of its writing. That's something that through looking at the New Left and female students in the New Left, I was originally drawn through the fact that there were prominent women. And I was like, well, I keep being told that there were no women in the New Left. It was like, it was just a male movement. Then there was the women's lib movement, but then there's this woman and this woman and this woman. But then as I looked more and more, it seems that even those prominent women were not where the biggest story was. This was a generation, a whole generation was involved and implicated in the events that we call the New Left. So what was their experience of this? So with this in mind, I'm turning to focus on what I call housewife activism, particularly in coal mining communities in post-war Japan. So my next major research project, which I've started to do archival research and some interviews, will focus, as Professor Long said, on, we'll begin with a focus on a coal mining community specifically, but I'm interested in how social movements in regional Japan took on high economic growth period narratives of progress and expert authority in their bids to gain recognition for health and environmental damages in the 1960s and 70s. So I started with this coal mining community because I thought I was interested, I knew I was interested in coal mining. And there's not a lot of scholarship in English that's recent about coal and Japan. And I hooked up with a group of scholars who are working on former coal mining in Japan, but they're mostly sociologists. So how do you bridge this gap between there's stuff that's really interesting about the imperial period, and there's more and more work about forced labor and things like that, and then how do you bridge that gap with sociology of the rationalization of the coal mines, which started in the 60s. But then I went to this town, Omuta, and as my guide was showing me around, a local archivist there, he asked me if I wanted to meet a woman in her 80s who had been involved in a decades-long legal battle against Mitsui, which is the former Zaibatsu, a huge company. And I said I would. And it turns out she's incredibly lucid. I think her anger keeps her alive. She's but her husband got carbon monoxide poisoning in a explosion, one of the largest industrial accidents in Japan in 1963, in the Mitsui Nikkei mine, coal mine. And carbon monoxide poisoning was not necessarily something that was recognized as an actual result, an actual disability as a result of that explosion. And so I began to think about all the kind of interesting questions that were raised about, in light of what I call this kind of naive politics, all these interesting questions that were raised about authority and expertise, And then also as I went through her photographs, she went everywhere. She was deeply involved with the Minamata movement. So Minamata is about industrial pollution, and it overwhelmingly affected fishing families, people who were considered behind the times, right? They were kind of old, and they were not listened to for a long time. She went to Sandizuka, where there was a battle against land dispossession by the farmers who lived there to build Narita Airport. Think about that next time you fly into Tokyo. So she went to Sandizuka, and of course she was married to a coal miner at a time when even the labor unions, other industries' labor unions, had struggled to get their workers behind coal miners because coal was over, and so even coal miners were becoming a relic of the past. So this also got me thinking about ideas about progress, people who are behind the times, and how they find a voice for their concerns, particularly at a time when progress is the dominant narrative. And then also it got me interested in this housewife activism because of the role of housewife labor in this particular period. Because of my project on the New Left, I looked into this a bit, and housewife labor was both critical for Japan's post-war economic growth, because it made it possible for women to act as a flexible labor force, and it facilitated high levels of male commitment to the workforce. So a lot of times, the rise of the mass phenomenon of a housewife is seen only as linked to the motor of industry and progress. And that is both true, but also housewife activism could be incredibly radical in a way that worker activism could not be, because they couldn't be fired. I mean, I guess they could, but they couldn't be fired. And so when I started to look, when I started to look at, when I looked at the New Left, a lot of jail support stuff, the QN Center, which I believe still even exists, the number you would call, the number you'd write on your arm when you got arrested as a New Left activist, when you got thrown out of the barricade, was this center, and it was run by housewives. Also, the networks that facilitated U.S. military deserters' path out of Japan to Sweden, housewife activism. Also, what made it possible for labor unions to wage protracted strikes, like the year-long strike at Mitsui Nikkei coal mine, housewives. They even did a sit-in in the mine, I'm trying to think about how I can think about housewife labor and its many different forms and expectations. Also to think about how people who are considered behind the times, coal miners, fishing families, and farmers, people who were in the obstructing progress, how were they able to forge networks? How are they able to articulate critiques to progress? How are they able to be heard? Because ultimately, in many ways, it's a success story. In 1970, Japan passed, in what was called the pollution diet, passed some of the world's strictest pollution laws in the world. And in many ways, it's a very ambivalent legacy because of Japan's rise of pollution export, and pollution can never be contained by national borders as well. And Japan's pollution export has also been to places that are considered, behind. There are also ideas of progress, like, well, we have these laws because we are advanced and civilized, or something like that. So I'm curious, how did domestic ideas in Japan about progress, development, those who are modern, those who are behind, influence Japan's society history, but also interactions with the region? So, and I do think that emphasizing Japan as a site from explore these issues, we can think about a critical non-Western context that has served and continues to serve as both a model for development and modernization in the region, and also as a site with a long history of critique and open opposition to modernizing narratives. And I want to end very quickly with here's another more secretarial work in the barricades. I want to end with this image which I put on my poster after much long tortured debate, because it's a really sexy image, and it speaks to the kind of 1960s iconography of street protest and confrontation. And it's a very gripping image. And I guess with what I'm saying, though, is maybe we need to be a little suspect of this, how seductive images like this are. It's still an awesome image, but because how do you illustrate endless debate? I have a lot of photos of meetings of people talking, hashing things out, but it doesn't photograph as well, right? Yeah, what can better illustrate the sometimes tedious but nevertheless endless debates that configure and reconfigure our relationships with each other, our work, and the world. So that's the direction my work is taking now, and I'm going to end because I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for letting me share.
We have lots of time, so this session ends officially at 12:30, I think, and we did ask Kelsey to speak for a short amount of time because we know how much the community likes to talk and discuss, so please chime in.
This is great. I'm really interested in so many threads you put out. I wanted to throw out two things for you to take in either direction, because you talked about situating this New Left within kind of global New Left. And the two things I was thinking of, one sort of Japan specific, is whether Bill Marati's work on Japan in this, does it end up reinforcing the sort of male focus or not? And the other is if you're thinking of different settings, I work on China, so I was immediately thinking of women are very present in the Red Guards at this time. But I thought the most interesting parallel or comparison might be Germany. If you're talking about whether there's a distancing from, whether there's the same move to have the mistakes of the war era thought of as a male thing. So anyway, you want to jump in and do those?
Yeah, sure. Marati's work does it. Certainly doesn't really write about the women that were present, and
that's what I thought.
It is problematic. So I mean, here's another problem: is that there were so many male thinkers, writers, cultural producers who produced amazing work that I love and I think is great in the period and became really iconic. And I think that it is important to understand what they're saying and what they're doing. But I just every time came up against this block, that there were clearly women there, deeply involved, and not only had their stories not been told, but they had not been theorized in a fundamental way into the New Left, and it seemed crazy because if you also look at the 40s and 50s, some of the first exercises of the right to protest in post-war Japan are women's groups. The housewife union forums at that time, and Women's Democratic Club, and so a lot of the women who were involved in the New Left didn't want to be part of that naive politics. They didn't want to be part of defending the domestic sphere. They wanted to be part of this radical call. They didn't want to argue about the price of rice or whatever, and protect the children. But then they got really caught in this spot where they were in this movement that was talking about human liberation, but meaning, kind of masculine liberation. And so I have a real problem. I love films from that time, but there's just so much rape and so much rape that's supposed to be political and about masculinity and crises of masculinity, but it's nevertheless still projected onto the bodies of women. And free sex comes to mean in the movement free male access to women, without any thought about an active subjectivity from your partner or anything. So I mean, I think there's a place to really understand those iconic cultural producers. At the same time, there's this huge blind spot. And I just, yeah. And then for China, so the Red Guards, I took a class with Guobi Yang about power and protest in China, and where we read some of your work. And the question of how female participation operating the Red Guards was so interesting to me, but it's just totally a different thing. West Germany, so there are lots of really interesting potential sites for comparison. West Germany, Mexico, there's some really interesting work about how masculinity operated in the Mexican case. Because a lot of the new lefts, in a sense, do become like, because there's a sense that there's male power, and so it's like against the man. Sometimes it almost becomes this kind of like Oedipal thing where it's between the young men and the old men, they're gonna duke it out or whatever. But what also became interesting, and I write about it in my book too, is like in Japan, sometimes instead of the man, it was mama, interestingly. Yeah, I know, stick with me for a second. Because of the way that women were configured as being so strong in the post-war period, and so a lot of what I guess was kind of like Oedipal in the United States or whatever, becomes about these young men, especially at elite institutions, so University of Tokyo, these young men trying to get away from mama. And mama becomes the representative of domestic, like of bourgeois domesticity, and so if you're a radical, it was kind of, one writer wrote in retrospect, he said it was a total taboo to talk about your mom, and people would like hide, they'd like call their mom and like hide in a corner and check in with their, their mother or whatever. I think there's tons of fun stuff for comparative stuff. And I put together a panel at AHA with 6 different panels of people from different areas, because I think also like in Latin American studies, there's so much interesting stuff on this period too. Or even like Pacific studies, colonial Africa. I mean, so I hope that maybe more structural and like stuff can be done later. Thank you.
My name is Jung Chen, in Station Department. Just piggybacking on your question about gender. As I was listening, I was just listening with Korea. It's exactly the same.
Yeah.
The way it was developing in 1980s, the 70s and 80s.
Oh.
Korea is, I guess, one decade later.
Yeah,
But the gender dynamics and hierarchy and especially this year, I mean, there has been some female writers who've been writing about this in Korea, including the one that's coming to give a talk next week. But women have been kind of quiet about that, and it is widely known kind of a fact. But women intellectuals who have been involved in that have been quiet.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, this past year, Me Too sort of broke out, and there are huge kind of scandals about this and that, but that is just tip of an iceberg. And I mean, you mentioned the rape and free access to women and in the barracks and the prison and things of that sort. So it's kind of coming out from the women's side in Japan.
You mean in contemporary society?
Yes.
I just taught Me Too in one of my classes.
Okay.
We were doing comparative social movements and really contemporary stuff. It was really hard to get them to talk about it. I mean, in class, I mean, I'm not expecting them to make a confession or something in class. But there have been a few really high-profile cases. A journalist who later said she was raped. But it's kind of this question about why Me Too is not really taking off. And I get a feeling, so a lot of times when I think about gender, I think about how it's related to labor, right? And I feel like, sexual discrimination or gender discrimination in Japan, it can be so linked with power harassment and, as it can be anywhere.
Yeah.
But I think that people right now often feel so precarious in their jobs, and there is like an expectation that you just will be exploited in your work. So I think that makes it really hard. I think.
Are you talking about in Japan or?
I'm talking about in Japan, yeah. And I think what's interesting is there was definitely an earlier generation in like the 80s and 90s, a few high-profile cases of sexual harassment in the workplace, and women won those cases, including a woman I work with now. And this is again, like, I just don't see progress. My students love to be like, well, it's that, it's getting better, and it's like, there's no promise that it's gonna get better. And in fact, I think when I look at the history, I feel like it's almost getting kind of worse, because I think that in the New Left, a lot of women didn't feel they could speak up. There was a women's liberation movement that was quite influential in the 1970s, 80s, and then there were many like legal cases and stuff, and then now I feel like people feel very precarious in their work, and that doubly influences women to maybe put up with stuff that they don't feel empowered to speak out against it. I would guess, yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm interested in I love your three keywords: care, authority, and protest, and your argument that when we talk about female revolutionaries in the New Left and writing them back into that history, it's not that what was revolutionary about what they were doing is what's revolutionary about care in general, which is that it is this unacknowledged support of maintenance and sustainability, but also in a kind of environmental humanities theoretical frame, it's an acknowledgement of indebtedness to the actual material circumstances that make life and thought possible.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, as you embark on your second project, which is very firmly rooted in the 60s and in discourses of progress, how you imagine, or if you imagine, bridging that sort of historical moment to the present when what's progressive, and the whole reason we're having a search in environmental humanities, is precisely the ability to acknowledge that indebtedness, right? So it's no longer, so we can go on just giving people credit for violence and big ideas and the big histories, but meanwhile the planet is dying and we're all in kind of big trouble. So like theoretically, so I get discouraged by the lack of theoretical attention to the work of care, because it seems like we're going to just have to keep going on rewriting, regendering history, unless we come up with a much more robust way to insist how this wasn't just the quiet sustenance. It was a So how are you thinking about those ideas in your work, and what, Kano Ayako's recent book on the history of feminist debates does end with care as a kind of new direction Because otherwise we are still getting, oh, well, should we listen to Takamura Itsue, or was she really a fascist? And it's just these boring cycles. So especially given your networks of in Japan, how do you see something new emerging from this moment of ecological crisis rather than cycles?
Yeah, so actually, I was just, I was talking with let me start here and see if I end up where I want to. So I was talking to a gender historian in Hungary, where they have just outlawed gender studies, or de-accredited gender studies, because it's not a science. So, you know, it's not just the environment, it's the humanities that are under attack too, right? But you know, she was talking about her frustration that there are so many her stories coming out in Eastern Europe that are just nationalist. They're writing women in, but it's like, oh, women were also there, like women were also sharpshooters, and like the women's version of the nationalist story or whatever. And yeah, I think that care can point us into a new kind of direction, and I think that the reason that women in care are so closely yoked also in our studies is because that is how women have been yoked to, women have been understood to figure into work, right, into labor. So then, let me see, as care, so in this next project, I guess what interested me particularly about looking at, you know, starting with a coal miner's wife, is that, you know, the movement to keep the coal mines open in Japan is also one of these ambivalent moments where the labor union narrative is exposed to be pretty simplistic, in a sense where it's like, if we keep these jobs and we keep the mine open, this is success. But then from this really bigger picture, it's not, maybe not. But then what interested me about Matsuo Keiko, when I talked with her, you know, she also kept everything. So it's like I met her, so I didn't mention that part. I met her, she's lucid, I interviewed her, she saved everything, her daily planners, everything. And you look at the books on her shelf, and she's reading about Burakamine, and she's reading about, you know, widely about Minamata, and she goes and speaks to, and this is also where it does with the New Left. There were some medical students or science students at Kyushu University who invite her to speak, and they're very much, oh, I have an image from when she spoke there. No, I don't! Oh yes, here it is. From when she spoke there, and like they're on their little pamphlet, they draw this like creature that's like the man with the money throws the money at this creature, and then it has chemicals and like so I guess what I'm saying is that it's watching how maybe these housewife activists operated. They were in charge with care work in support of the national economy. But then when they took their mission really seriously, it led them to conclusions that were very inconvenient for everybody. The coal miners' union formed the housewives' union, kind of the ladies' auxiliary, right? And they made women join this housewives' union in the beginning, as it operated in Nikkei. And there were different kinds of housewives' unions actually in different coal mining communities. But once these women were organized in this union, sometimes they could not be controlled by what the labor union wanted them to do or didn't want them to do. Matsuo Keiko, the labor union did not want her to still go after Mitsui after a certain point, right? So I guess that I'm just trying to tease out those tensions, and I was thinking a lot about this also with recent news, of course, in the United States about, is it jobs versus the environment, right? Especially with coal mining. And it's also kind of coming back in Japan in a sense. There's a recent popular book called, and I'm forgetting the author at the moment, she's a popular writer, called Mukashi Genbatsu Ima Tanko, So it's like once nuclear power, now coal. Because Japan is using tons of coal right now. They're just not mining it. And they haven't, well, I mean, there's one last mine, but they're not mining it. And she kind of revisits the history of coal mining, and it's always been an ambivalent history. Yes, I'm hoping to tease out, use the story of someone who's, use the story of people who are there and have certain care duties or feel responsibilities, and see how they negotiate these different interests, criticize them. I think that, I mean, I don't know if history teaches us lessons, like history doesn't have like a lesson, but maybe there are some like survival strategies there, or something that we can learn in that history. So in one sense, that's just an intuition, but I'm hoping to find that through that.
Thank you very much. So you, excuse me, you began with two straw men that won't blow away, and I want to add a third,
Okay.
which is this idea that Japanese society lives in unusual harmony with their natural surroundings.
Yes, in environmental history coming out of Japan, that's very strong, right?
And just and culturally, the Japanese take great pride in their tradition of sustainable environmental management, from Midori no Reto, the Green Archipelago, to the culture of Motainai. These are things that are routinely invoked in popular culture and public memory. And historians, especially those outside of Japan, have devoted a lot of ink to beating down these myths.
Yeah.
From looking at the protest movement of Tanaka Shozo in the Meiji period, to Brett Walker's look at the toxic archipelago in the 60s and 70s, and the industrial pollution that came as a result of the modernity, that these movements that you describe. I'm wondering, and yet in so doing, they've turned almost exclusively to male figures. In mapping out an alternative environmental tradition that is inherently contentious.
Yeah.
I think we now appreciate that that conflict has been a huge part of the environmental tradition in Japan. And yet there are very few female voices that have been kind of amplified to make this point. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what a gendered lens looks like, and if there's room for a Rachel Carson in this tradition.
Well, there's also Rachel Carson in
There's
that
also
tradition.
Rachel Carson.
She was translated pretty quickly into Japanese. I think that that's where also like my interest in you know, I think a lot of people who are in environmental history are very concerned about the environment, and I am new to kind of looking at environmental history, but a lot of writers of environmental history are also male. It's like a very male field, and it is interesting to me because it's like, well, gender studies is like a very female, like it's like there are a lot of women in gender studies, there are a lot of men in environmental history, and that was kind of one of the, this is actually one of my questions too, is it's like, how can we think about how social injustices, and my research so far has talked more about gender-based social injustices, link with environmental injustices, or how can social expectations based around gender roles also influence, you know, how people can think about movements for environmentalism. I think Simon Avenell's recent book about transnational, oh my gosh, what's it called? It's transnational environmental activism in Japan or something. He does discuss more female activists, but you know, Avenell has we both have kind of like a similar trajectory. He also wrote first about civic activism around 1960 Ampo, and he did include female activists, but did not incorporate the gender and political context in a way that I thought made their activism like legible. Like, why were these women pushed forward of certain movements, right? And I feel like he does the same thing in his new book, which is an interesting book and an important book. But I think the question for me is also, why did certain women become symbolic of certain environmental crises? I mean, if we think of Minamata, we think of the Eugene Smith photos of that's sometimes called like the Minamata Pieta, the mother bathing her child in the bath. So how can we negotiate those like very feminine symbols with women's activism, I guess? I'm not sure if that really gets to the heart of what you're asking, but I think that how can we think about different kinds of women? And this is also why housewife activism is kind of interesting, because there are all different kinds of housewives, right? Like, so one of the first and most biggest housewife unions is housewife organizations is Schufuren, and this is from their 1995 New Year wishes, and the caption says, first wishes for the new year: if things go on like this, Japan will sink. We all need to protect it. And then I don't think you can really see it so well, but it's like the little girl says, earthquakes, and then that man says, import of dangerous drugs, and the grandma says acid rain. Remember acid rain? And then the older man is concerned about political issues, and then the other man is concerned about arms dealing, I think. And then this woman says Hoshano and Florin. And so I guess I'm just kind of interested, like, yeah, okay, these are everybody's issues, but why is it that the women are articulating the environmental issues? It's almost like the women's responsibility to articulate the environmental issues, and like and the housewife, the Schufuren particularly embraces that role and talks about linking hands with the mothers of the world. And so that's why I understand it as like a really powerful strategy for women to step forward and say, we are protecting the environment, we protect our households, we protect daily life. But then it also means that women can't necessarily themselves connect those issues with politics. It's like their role is always just to speak of the disaster, and then hopefully male politicians will be forced to incorporate it or something like that. And I think Matsuo Keiko is a little different from these housewives, because she's in a blue-collar community. The nature of coal mining communities mean that everybody's involved in the work. She's a housewife, but she did a lot of the work sorting coal and stuff like that. I mean, her back is really bad because of all this other labor she did. So I'm also kind of interested in these differences between housewives and stuff.
Thank you for the talk. A couple of related questions. In the context of the New Left, could you talk more about the extent to which the feminist movement in Japan is constrained by the nation state, and possibilities for the post-national and the transnational, and what the pitfalls are? What do you need to be aware of? And the second question is, in the Japanese context, how does the politics of gender, enter the space of intersectionality without being preempted by the intersectional? There is the specificity versus fungibility within the intersectional space. So if you could talk more about what those forces are that promote intersectionality, and which forces would be deleterious for the specificity of the feminist movement.
Yeah. I'm going to start just a moment with intersectionality, because when I was beginning this project, the New Left is narrated as very male, and it's also like the New Left specifically, for all their rhetoric about global connections and stuff like that, you find cases of particularly some exchange students, like from China and Vietnam, who really risked their visa status to engage in protests. And I mean, you're from Vietnam and you risk your visa status studying in Tokyo, you know, your risk is just so much bigger, right? But that was not, they were not really involved, like, in the, or embraced by the Japanese New Left. I mean, embraced in a sort of maybe symbolic way. And this is also similar in like accounts by many Zainichi people Korean people who grew up in Japan at the time. They were like, this was not our struggle. And then it was also, you know, cast as very male. But part of the reasons I focused particularly on women is that women were like an inside-outsider rather than an outsider. And in Japan in this period, while not exactly the truth, the myth of being homogenous in terms of class and ethnicity meant that the main kind of defining difference was gender difference. And so the reason women were a really important source of flexible labor is because there was no political will for immigration. There was a labor crisis in Japan in the 1960s too. There was a labor shortage. But Japan was not going to let in immigrants, right? So that was something that was part of the reason why I landed particularly on gender, although I just found a bunch of resources about the Vietnamese students protesting in Japan, so hopefully I can consider that a bit. Feminism in the nation state. So I think that you know, feminism in the 1970s in Japan in many ways was reacting to experiences in the New Left. And in that sense, it was both global and local. Global in its imaginary, and kind of local in some of its concerns. But I think in the 80s, with a lot of the activism and the activist scholarship between Japan and South Korea, I think that's a really important movement of how feminism in Japan led to scholarship that helps us understand the role of women in Japan in the support of the Japanese Empire. Because I really think that when I look at like books about women's history and stuff in the immediate post-war, it's all kind of women were outside of politics and now they're in politics kind of thing. And it was a generation of women who went through, you know, women's lib, forging alliances with, you know, uneasy alliances, sometimes with women in other countries, mostly South Korea, and then examining the role of women in the wartime period. So I take a lot of, I'm really interested in that. And then, so something is, when I started studying the New Left, I thought the New Left was really cool. And I want to qualify that. I thought it was really interesting, but I also thought it was this really radical challenge. And in some ways it is. But now the reason I'm kind of looking at this housewife activism is because there were also these sort of housewife, like women activists that would still call themselves Fujin, which means like lady, or like, I mean, it's hard to translate, but it was very rejected by women's lib and feminists, like, we're not Fujin, we're onna, we're josei and stuff. And, but then when I started to look at some of the things that groups like Fujin Ninshu Club did, or Women's Democratic Club, I mean, they were going to international women's conferences in the Eastern Bloc and forging all these really interesting connections that have not been historically evaluated. It's like housewives movements like Shufuden, or it's like, and then like I was talking about the New Left, but so I think there are some other forms of feminism and transnationalism and globalism that need to be examined that haven't really been looked at yet. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you for a very interesting talk. I apologize for not having been able to hear all of it because I very much enjoyed what I did hear. But at the same, I mean, I think you're making some really interesting theoretical advances, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, I get very discouraged, especially after listening to David saying, where are all, why is it that women aren't part of the study? Because I keep thinking of things like After the State, where he does talk about women against the state by David Abner, where he does talk about how women were very much involved in the protests against NIDARE, where you've got these old, the old grandmothers up in trees throwing feces at the police. It's an image I've always loved. But they were there, and people have talked about them. You've got Barbara Steinhoff's work on the women in the Red Army, Three Women Who Loved the Left, where she talks precisely about this issue of the woman who was the caregiver while her husband was in prison. And then there's the book, and I'm thinking, I can't remember the author's name, it's driving me crazy, on the consumer protection movement, and how housewives in the 60s and 70s were at the forefront of trying to develop, I mean, they weren't just, they were also, of course, involved in women were at the forefront of the anti-pollution movements, and the reason why they could do that is they said, we're doing this for the sake of our children.
Isn't that the Bicycle Citizens, Robin?
There's that book,
Oh,
yeah,
uh-huh.
that's one book, but there's another book, and I've got it on my shelf, and I can see it in my mind's eye, but I can't see the name of the author, and it was about the consumer protection movement, and how women were very much involved in that, and trying to make sure that, what they bought for their families were things that were, weren't toxic. And so these, I see this as, maybe I'm old, I admit, but I see these things as coming in cycles, and yes, they have been talked about, but somehow that gets forgotten.
I think that I mean that's a great point, and probably if we all should be lucky to live long enough, we'll see these kinds of cycles too. But I think that maybe David is speaking to, like, and I'm not going to speak for you, but like in terms of environmental history stuff, like all of these works. I mean, maybe Patricia Steinhoff's on the Red Army is kind of more social movements. All of these things, not it's not a fault with the authors or the way they wrote them, because I do agree with you that David Apter's Against the State, and about San Musica, he very much considers like the land dispossession issues and things like that. But there has been kind of this disconnect between like writing about, I would say, literatures of social movements and environmental movements or environmental history. And I think that women's consumer movements, that also I just think is something that gets so easily dismissed for the reasons that I mentioned, like about care work, because
It's truly depressing.
yeah, because Matsuo Keiko also would go to the meetings about the Morinaga Mirugu scandals and all these things. But I think that consumer issues sometimes for people interested in radical politics, and myself included when I started this project, was like too mild or something. But now that I have gone through and explored more about how difficult, more difficult it is to sustain a movement, and how many times the consumer movement was a strategy for being able to make other kinds of demands and more demands, and also just a really important watchdog on industry. I think that there is a necessity to keep environmental humanities' eyes on social movements, I would argue.
Yeah. As I said, because the women were involved in the anti-pollution. I mean, we're at the core of the anti-pollution movements too, and I can't think of the book I want to think about there too. But anyway, I think.
Any grad students want to pipe in?
I was kind of saving this question for our meeting later, but I'll say it now. So I'm in comparative literature, and I'm really interested in the ways that the kind of things that you're talking about are represented in literature or other forms of media. And so I'm curious about, you know, what has been your engagement with like literature and film. You mentioned film earlier, just kind of creative products.
So I engage a little bit with film. I got really frustrated trying to engage deeply with film. And there was kind of a joke so I was trained at Columbia and I was in the East Asian Languages and Cultures department. At the beginning, we all felt very flexible, like both the people who studied literature and history, we were like, we're not going to be those historians who can't do textual analysis, or like, we're not going to be literary people who get so bogged down in the text. And then in our writing groups, like there would be kind of this like, you know, the historian would be like, you really only talk about one case. Is this, you know, can we really make a conclusion, you know, of the literature person? So we kind of got into these disciplinary sort of routines. So I will admit that I think when I did deal with some film, I dealt a little bit with some literature. I took out some parts about literature from the book because I felt like my readings were kind of amateurish. So I think that that's a skill that I can work on, and that's something that would excite me to learn from a lot of people here. A lot of you are very strong in that. Because I do find myself sometimes as a historian like using books. And so I'll admit to that being a bit of a weakness. But I did write a bit about film because I found the continual use of rape in films that I actually otherwise really liked quite disturbing.
Fair enough. Can I kind of respond? It seems like you've got a lot of sort of visual material though. Like you're so maybe photography and you know these kind of little you know
Cartoons and stuff.
Cartoons, yeah. Do you see a lot of this kind of media popping up, or?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to bore with you all of this. I knew if I only did images, we'd just spend the whole time talking about images. But yeah, I think that not only so there's another thing that demonstrates sort of male government against female concern. So the people say we're terrified of this pollution. The government says it's all right, everything is fine. This is from Showa 54. Oh my gosh, 54. 1979. Okay. So yeah, depictions of these things are also really important and really powerful, and that's where I feel like, you know, again, admitting that I am not the greatest close textual analyst. I also have to say that my book will not be, it's not just by me. There are so many other people who read it and helped me read it. So I do find that also using visual materials always helps me read materials. Even my students can get something that maybe I didn't quite see before. Which can be dangerous because you can totally lose control of the narrative. But that's where I would say that, I mean, you have to play to your strengths and then also be able to be in contact with other people. Because I love images and they're so evocative. Yeah.
I like many arguments you made. I think trying to think through some materials and evidences you're listing here in terms of how the environment and the humanities can be seen more closely. One is you started the presentation with this female activist who got this PhD degree in biological sciences, and I'm really like my question is, you know, like how her biological or scientific training was informing her larger thinking of the movement and protest at that period, and you know, just like thinking about the student demographics of the time in general, like I assume perhaps around half or over half of them were studying science, that kind of thing. So I take science and environment as the backdrop of this movement. So
Mhm.
how they're intertwining with the movement in a way.
Right.
And a related question to that is similar to the way Mimi talks about care. I'm interested in the way you talk about sustainability. So I'm trying to see how sustainability is not just an organizational concept to talk about the care work, but also like how you think of this kind of organizational process in together with the environmental landscape of the period. Thank you.
Okay. So Tokoro Mitsuko, I think that her experience as someone getting an advanced degree in biology did inform her politics, but it made her very, very skeptical of science. And I think the New Left in general, another criticism you could make is that it was pretty romantic and in some ways maybe like a classical anti-progress. Like, I try to save it from being just purely like reacting to progress, but very much in questioning common sense. It also questioned a lot of different kinds of logic. One of its favorite kind of cries was nonsense. Like, that's how you could cut anybody off or shut anybody off. You would just say, this is nonsense, And I've been struggling with writing a paper about a group of female students and male students who organized around a female student who did not get into a graduate school program. And she did not get into a graduate school program. The professor who denied her entry sent a letter to her father saying if she went to graduate school, her time to get married would run away from her and she would never get married and she'd be very unhappy, so she should not go to graduate school. And and then they're like, this was a classic case of kind of like nonsense, but it was also the prevailing common sense at the time. And in some ways, the professor was right within the social context of the time, right? So nonsense was this common battle cry, but Tokoro Mitsuko, again, I think that what's interesting is her use of Simone Weil, that also she says, and because she went to graduate school, got her PhD in biology, she recognized that there are these limits to knowledge, right? Like, she could know a certain thing in biology, but there was still this huge uncertainty. And then she saw that this kind of science was used to, burn down forests and villages in Indochina, and she said, well, why, science says it's objective, but it creates its own kind of mystifications, right? That doesn't necessarily really help us necessarily with science and the environment. And I think in the New Left, it became a lot about your feelings, but one of the legacies of the global New Left also has probably been that it's just about your personal feelings without thinking about responsibility for others. So if it feels good, do it, right? But that doesn't account for the other. And this is, again, where I have a problem with the New Left masculinity, the idea about free sex. It was like, well, if it feels good, don't be held back by marriage or convention, except that maybe it doesn't feel good to your partner, right? I think what Tokoro is interesting is that she is talking about how to be responsible, to care for others or nurture others and consider others. And she does get a sense that science is not the end-all be-all because there's really a big unknown. And it depends what questions you ask. Are you asking just questions about how to best wage warfare with science? You'll come up with a different set of answers than if you're asking a different question. Your second question, in terms of care and sustainability within the movement. So when I mentioned that the women's liberation movement was something that came out of the New Left, a kind of ecological movement also came out of the New Left. But here's another question, is that but there was not a Green Party like there was in West Germany, which also came out of a strong New Left movement. And in some ways in Japan, we see this model where the sort of protest demands were incorporated into business as usual. So they passed strict pollution ordinances, and then problem solved in a technocratic fashion, right? But I think that the New Left, maybe because of its focus on spectacular politics and confrontations, was not able to have the kind of sustainability that consumer rights movements did, or housewife activism did at the same time.
We're at exactly 90 minutes, it was perfect, thank you so much, we really appreciate it.